23 years ago in 2002, a freshman running back was dominating college football. As a freshman, Maurice Clarett led Ohio State to a BCS National Title. But despite walking off the field as a 19-year-old, fully healthy national champion, after the biggest game of his life, he would never play another down of big-time football. The reasons for that go down a bit of a rabbit hole. A destructive mindset, poor decision making, and a tendency to want to rush every process all heavily contributed to the fragility of Maurice Clarett's career. Once a single domino fell, they all crashed to the ground, and everything in Maurice's life fell on his face one by one, till nothing was left standing. While Maurice made many mistakes, which I'll discuss throughout the video, if we had to boil it all down to a single trigger point, this dude's life was essentially uprooted by quote-unquote illegal benefits. Reggie Bush lost his Heisman over this stuff, but Maurice Clarett lost everything. Thanks to NIL, today players whose resumes are basically empty receive much more than either of these players received at that time. The difference is today it's perfectly legal. But during Maurice's time, being caught accepting cash or cars or clothes or even extra food could land you in hot water with the NCAA. If you're not brand new to college football, you've seen this play out. Now here's the thing, the rules prior to NIL didn't make sense due primarily to poor leadership, and the rules after NIL still don't make sense due to that same poor leadership. But for a player, falling on the wrong side of that coin could make all the difference in the places life takes you. In a way, it's similar to marijuana laws. It's mostly legal now, but there still are people who are suffering consequences from a time when it was not legal. And while it's easy to say, well, at the time it wasn't legal, therefore the people should have followed the law, I think it's also important to ask a simple question. Why was it ever illegal in the first place? Like many of the marijuana laws, the NCAA's illegal benefit rules were never fair, they were never just or even logical, and were largely propped up by ridiculous propaganda. But with that said, that's often the way of the world. And while, as you can see, I have no issue pointing that out, I also don't live in a fantasy land where I think it's wise to live this life as if everything in society is ideal. Because it's run by humans and we're highly flawed, even the best systems we invent will have their issues. But it's your job as a person trying to navigate this world to be aware of those issues and move accordingly. Throughout this story, I'll pull out lessons that we can take with us so we can learn and be entertained at the same damn time. Maurice Clarett thought of himself as a street dude, and his belief about himself manifested in reality. Throughout his life, he attracted everything a street dude attracts, including a lavish but extremely temporary lifestyle, along with the anxiety and paranoia of walls closing in all around him. His two biggest crimes include armed robbery with no mask and alleged intentions to take the life of the witness. This landed the former freshman phenom behind bars, and it marked the lowest point of his fall from grace. He fell from the highest heights of the football universe to the lowest valleys of the criminal world. But against all odds, he found his way out and climbed his way back up to the surface. Bad decisions are like the excuses that justify them. Everybody makes them, it's just a fact of life. So at one point or another, you'll take the wrong turn or take a bad step and end up on the ground. And this is a story about falling hard, but through time, rehabilitation, and most importantly, a mental shift, you can once again stand up on your own 2 feet. Chapter 1. As a Man Thinketh. Maurice Clarett grew up in Youngstown, Ohio, and started playing football when he was 6 years old. Back then, Maurice played nearly every position except the one that would make him famous. Maurice described himself as a fat kid who loved to eat. Dude said his position changed as his appetite did. If he fell in love with the donuts, he'll play defensive line. If he dropped a couple pounds, linebacker or tight end. Youngstown, Ohio saw a surge of crime in the 80s and 90s and really beyond. But born in 1989, Maurice was suddenly completely immersed in the culture that followed. A culture that stood in opposition to the culture of football, and his life was boiled down to this one question: which of these cultures would win out? When Maurice was only 4th grade, he witnessed his first murder. And right then, at 10 years old, Maurice decided which side of the gun he wanted to be on. Right then and there. His mindset was etched in stone. As far as he was concerned, he was a gangster. A mindset that would only grow stronger throughout his life. He never states this explicitly in the articles and interviews, at least the ones I trekked through while researching this video, but there's a good chance that Maurice, at least early on, saw that way of life as his best chance for survival. When growing up in a community that's filled with violence and street culture, people respond in different ways. Some try to steer clear and survive until they can get out, while others think their best option is to integrate themselves into the culture so the culture can't hurt them, which unfortunately is a fallacy. The problem with integrating yourself into the environment is that once you do that, you can never really leave. Even if you have an NFL ticket, that way of life often follows you wherever you go. And if you're not extremely careful, it can destroy every positive thing around you. So the trouble Maurice found himself in later in his life wasn't a spoiled college kid trying to integrate himself into a street lifestyle. It was actually a kid raised in street culture trying to integrate himself into a college lifestyle. And by the way, failing miserably. Chapter 2. Drive slow, homie. By the time he finished middle school, Maurice had been placed in juvenile detention centers 3 different times. His crimes included carjacking, armed robbery, and of course the classic drug distribution. The way Maurice came up, an opportunity wasn't to be squandered, whether you hit a lick on a stolen vehicle or a new position on the football field. By 6th grade, Maurice had played most positions on the field, but the future Ohio State leading rusher had still never lined up at the running back position until one day at practice when the team didn't have enough guys show up to fill all the spots on the field. Maurice's coach asked him to fill in at running back, and by the time the starting running back came back to practice, he had to fill in at a different position. Hopefully you follow me with that. Maurice took the dude's spot. Maurice was never the obvious choice to put at running back. He was kinda chubby and didn't seem fleet of foot, but it turned out he was a natural at the position. He used his big frame and physical nature to run through opponents. He was elusive enough to avoid square tackles and found just enough of a gear to finish in the open field. Due to his talent, life moved fast for Maurice. When he was 15, going into his junior year of high school, he would transfer to a school called Warren Harding. This was 30 minutes away from his hometown. The hope was this would keep Maurice out of the streets, and it allowed some high school boosters to, let's say, invest in the program's success on the field. So they provided Maurice at 15 years old with an apartment of his own. Pretty damn crazy. Now the thing is, this could be a great stepping stone into maturity if the circumstances are set up right. So while Maurice would have probably got some of that, the thing is, it's not like he really had to pay bills. So he didn't learn the same lessons and responsibility as somebody who's got rent hanging over their head. If anything, it might have reinforced a sense of entitlement and a sense that everything is just supposed to come easy. But Maurice came into certain advantages early on, and he began associating that fast pace with success. He started to thrive off achieving things faster than the next guy, and he soon started to rush the process, every process. He never took the time to ask whether or not he was prepared for the next step. The rent worked itself out, so why wouldn't everything else? You won't be shocked to know that Maurice wanted to hang with the older guy. Again, he rushed every process, including growing up, but he didn't have the discernment to understand when the older guys were clearly setting him up for failure. When he was 8th grade, Maurice and some older dudes broke into the nicest looking house in the neighborhood. But once inside, they got the shock of their life. It was midday, but the owner was still there. So boom, Maurice dove out the 2nd story window and bust his head on the ground below. By the time he came to, my boy was in handcuffs, arrested and sent away for a full year. Because Maurice was always trying to rush through life, these sentences weren't all bad for him. This was the only time he slowed down to think, a seed that was planted by his first mentor. One of the officers who worked at the Juvenile Justice Center, where a teenage Maurice was serving his time, was also a high school football coach who saw Maurice's talent and decided to step in. This would plant a seed that grew slow, but but eventually would end up saving Maurice's life. To all the good dudes out there, I know trying to give advice to a younger cat often feel like a waste of time, but remember dog, all you can do is plant the seed and hope that somewhere down the line it'll get fertilized. The officer slash coach got the judge to agree to placing Maurice on house arrest instead, so he got him out of lockup, and he agreed to serve as Maurice's mentor and had Maurice transferred to the school where he was coaching. That was part of the deal. The other part of the deal was that Maurice was required to attend class and lift weights. As they lifted, the coach talked to Maurice about life, finding a positive crowd and not getting caught up in the streets. As I was just saying, at the time the advice probably seemed like it fell on deaf ears, but years later, the words would resurface in Maurice's mind. But with that said, the unfortunate part was that he'd have to get locked down again before the noise around him was quiet enough to remember the right voice. Alright, lesson number 1. It's really helped me to learn how to slow everything down and kind of quiet out the noise that's all around us. Zone out at the gym. Take a long ass shower. If you smoke, make sure you smoke alone sometime, and watch or read content that feeds your mind, not just distract you. But that's another lesson. Get some time and some space to kind of slow things down and watch how solutions come to you seemingly out of nowhere. Don't let something like prison be necessary just for you to quiet down the noise that's around you. Chapter 3. Maurice's new invention to speed up time. So Maurice committed to Ohio State, but the way it happened was kind of crazy. According to Maurice, Ohio State never really offered him. He said he hit them up and was like, yeah, I'm coming. He said he knew they'd get around to recruiting him eventually, so he got ahead of the process and recruited himself. Like I said, dude was always in a hurry. That theme comes up over and over with dude. He was in such a hurry that he tried to forego his senior year of high school. As a junior, he believed he was ready to start college, and he tried to put a plan into motion to make that happen. He was ultimately tripped up by a lack of English credits, but this wouldn't be the last time he tried to rush the process. So there's this thing athletes do called early enrollment. Today, football players do this a lot, where they don't wait to show up to college in the fall. They graduate high school in the spring and go straight to college. This allows true freshmen to attend spring training and get a head start on their college football education. If you ask the internet, the first notable player to do this was a quarterback named John David Booty. If this is your first time hearing about John David Booty, I'll give you a second to adjust to the name. John David enrolled at USC in the spring of 2003, but 1 year earlier, Maurice Clarett enrolled at Ohio State in spring 2002. If there was a way to speed up the process, Maurice would find it or create it if need be. Chapter 4. His opportunity. So when Maurice Clarett walked onto Ohio State campus, he was excited about the chance to prove his worth. Dude was confident, cocky even, as he quickly declared to his fellow running backs that he'd be the starting tailback when the season rolled around. Maurice later admitted that he knew nothing about being a good teammate, and he was completely locked in on his own personal success. But I'll say this, dude worked his ass off, trying to finish first in every single drill and be the strongest in all the lifts amongst the running backs. So while his motives weren't entirely pure on the football field, if you doing your job, a lot of times that's the best thing you can do for your teammate. So even if he wasn't the greatest guy in the locker room, his work ethic raised the level of everyone around him. Despite that, when they actually started practicing in the spring, Maurice found himself buried on the depth chart. As the last back to get in, he got all the garbage reps behind an underdeveloped offensive line, at which most of those dudes was never gonna play. And to make matters worse, most of the time they was going against the number 1 or 2 defense. One thing about Maurice is that his borderline narcissism at the time actually allowed him to find enjoyment in this process. And I like this, his mindset here is interesting. So being with that group with the last string O-line and going against the starting defense to Maurice meant more of an opportunity to showcase his natural ability, because in his words, being scout team meant you didn't have to follow strict rules when playing. Your only objective is to make the defense look bad. Okay, so this brings us to lesson number 2. The lesson here is that no matter how negative your traits might be perceived, when aimed correctly, correctly, they can be a force for positivity. So a lot of times it's about finding ways to aim your traits. Maurice thought he was so good that it benefited him to be placed in a disadvantageous situation. He saw it as an opportunity to showcase how cold he really was. A unique approach, but I gotta say, it sounds super effective. Maurice accepted the challenge and he practiced so hard that the coaches had no choice but to notice, despite the fact that he spent most of those plays getting brought down in the backfield. But the toughness he showed impressed the coaches, and when the spring was over and fall camp rolled around, they had to reevaluate the running back room. The last guy on the depth chart would now get reps with the starters, and the running back spot became an open competition. So like I said, Maurice was always looking for an opportunity to break in your house or steal your spot. And one day at practice, one of the backs kept fumbling, and then another one went down with an apparent ankle injury. So now it was just Maurice and one other dude getting all of the running back reps. That day, Maurice Clarett showed his true ability, and Coach Tressel called him into his office after practice. The coach told him he'd get the first shot at the starting position, but he only had 3 series to prove himself. Maurice got shut down on the first 2 series, but in the third one, he busted a 48-yard run, and he finished that game, his first college game ever, with 175 yards and 3 touchdowns. Chapter 5, Maurice thrives. Sometimes people are put in our lives to deliver a message or to warn us of upcoming danger. Whether we accept those warnings or not is 100% up to us. The Monday after Maurice rushed for 175, Coach Tressel again called him into his office. Maurice was expecting another pat on the back, but was disappointed to see it was just life advice. The coach talked to Maurice about leadership, friends, teamwork, girls. Here's another coach trying to give my dude some advice. Maurice nodded as the wisdom went in one ear and straight out the other one, just like before. In Maurice's mind, football was his escape from all the bad things in his life. Coach Tressel was trying to show him that in the long run, the game would only open the door for more bad things to enter if Maurice didn't learn to handle himself. But when you're always in a hurry, like Maurice was, you see advice and wisdom is boring and unhelpful. You'd rather be distracted than actually corrected. Lesson number 3. I've had this exact issue pretty recently. I had a guy who I'm assuming is unsubscribed now. If you're still here, bro, appreciate that. But at one point he was upset and called me out. He said something about how I used to be his escapism, his distraction from life that he can turn on and zone out. But now I was bringing up real life problems, which essentially killed his vibe and made him feel bad. But what he left out was the fact that I wasn't just bringing up problems. I was actually giving advice on how to address them. But the issue for some people is that addressing these issues actually requires you to do some work. And sometimes we just not ready to do that. We would rather be distracted from our problems instead. But just because we ignore the problems doesn't mean they go away. In fact, the longer we ignore them, the stronger they get. Here's a quote from Maurice about that convo with Coach Tressel. I didn't care to hear what he had to say at the time, and in the long run, I paid the price. He tried to give me the game plan for success, but I just wasn't ready. I was caught into the fast life. Now, to cut him a little slack, getting caught in the fast life wouldn't have been hard to do in Maurice's situation. Dude was going crazy on the field, bro, week after week as a true freshman, bro. Check out the game log. 175 yards and 3 scores in the first game, then 66 yards and 1 touchdown in only 11 carries in the second game. In game number 3, man, the dude went off. 230 yards and a couple touchdowns. And he didn't rush for under 100 yards again until they basically stopped giving him carries. Now, I'm not sure what happened here like late in the season, if he got in trouble with the coaches or started to wear down. But in the biggest game of the year, the Fiesta Bowl for the national championship against Miami, Maurice's impact went beyond the standard box score. 47 yards on 2 touchdowns while averaging a minuscule 2 yards per carry isn't very good. But in the third quarter, with Ohio State up 14-7, quarterback who had a solid game threw one of his 2 interceptions. Now, this This right here could have drastically changed the game, as Ohio State was in the red zone and Sean Taylor jumped the route. A turnover here meant no points for Ohio State on that drive, which again could have drastically changed the outcome of the game. But Maurice hopped up from making a block and caught a quick angle to track down Sean Taylor. Dude stripped the ball and recovered it for the offense, eventually leading to an Ohio State field goal. The game would go into double overtime, as Ohio State only needed a field goal to tie the game up at the end of the fourth quarter. So Maurice saving those 3 points and taking away a chance for Miami to score greatly impacted the outcome of that game. Not to mention, once again, he scored 2 touchdowns. Chapter 6, As a Man Thinketh, Part 2. After one season at Ohio State, Maurice Clarett was a national champ, Big Ten Freshman of the Year, and first team All Big Ten. He also held the record for freshman rushing yards at the school and was the first freshman to lead the national title team in rushing in 10 years. Maurice had been in a hurry to make his mark, and he did it as quickly as he possibly could. But the problem with speed running the game is that once you finish, not only did you not enjoy the process of playing the game, but you burnt through the content and now you ain't got nothing to do. So back in chapter 1 I said, so the trouble Maurice found himself in later in his life wasn't a spoiled college kid trying to integrate himself into a street lifestyle. It was actually a kid raised in street culture trying to integrate himself into a college lifestyle. Now, here's why I said it. Maurice constantly affirms that up until his time in prison, he viewed himself as a gangster playing football. So everything he did was through that lens first and foremost. And this is gonna bring us to lesson number 4. Your core identity and how you see yourself is gonna inform every major decision you make. You ever wonder why so many athletes just describe themselves as hard workers as opposed to something like the most talented? They might be hyper talented, but a hyper talented player has a hard time coming to grips with a bad game or a bad season. A hard worker, on the other hand, will grind his way through anything. If a hard worker has success, he's gonna work hard. If a hard worker fails, he's gonna work hard. This gives you an identity that you can control because it's not based on the actual results. It's based on the process. And that's real smart because there will always be variables that you can't control. So be real careful with how you define yourself, because a bad definition can set you up for failure. Every culture has positives and negatives, but some mesh better with team sports than other ones. I've spoken about how Polynesian ancestral values go seamlessly with the football culture. They believe in focusing on community over the individual, or on the team over yourself, which is one of the reasons why they're the most overrepresented group in the NFL by percentages. Now, street culture is heavily steeped in Western ideals. American stuff, individualism, capitalism, create an inherent selfishness that infects this country. So with Maurice viewing himself in that way, he ends up leaning even further into these ideals. This led to an empty pursuit of all the wrong things, but it would take a while before Maurice could actually see it. Chapter 7. His first and his last. 4 days before the biggest game of his life, Maurice Clarett called out Ohio State. He said, quote, "That's why I'm ready to get this game over and go back home." Wait, what? How does a guy who loves football come to feel like this about the national championship at that? You know what I'm saying? The answer is both simple and complicated. A little over a week before the national title game, Maurice had a friend lose his life back in his hometown. Now, Maurice wanted to go home and attend the funeral, but due to reasons was unable to. Maurice said Ohio State gave him the runaround when he asked to attend the funeral. There's a lot of conflicting information till this day, where Maurice says one thing and Ohio State says another. But based on all the info, it seems to come down to one of two options. Maurice's claim was that they would not let him go, while Ohio State claims they simply wouldn't pay for him to go. Ohio State said he didn't fill out the proper paperwork, but that they told Maurice that he could still make the trip, but he'd have to pay for the travel cost up front. Then once the proper paperwork was filled out, he would be reimbursed for the amount in full. Here's a direct quote from the athletic director. He elected not to do that, pay for the travel, or couldn't afford to do that, or there wasn't anybody in his family who could do it. We were stuck in a place where the rule is we couldn't go forward and buy a ticket. That was upsetting to him, but there isn't any effort on our part to bar him from going anyplace. Now, Maurice seemed to believe this reasoning wasn't true. He seemed to believe that they didn't want him going home out of fear that he'd get in trouble or not be ready for the championship, which was in 4 days. Remember the quote I started with when I opened this chapter? That's why I'm ready to get this game over and go back home. Here's the full quote he made while addressing the funeral. I guess football is more important than a person's life than it. That's why I'm ready to get this game over and go back home. With a little more context, you can understand that quote better. A terrible situation for a team to be in just a few days before the biggest game of most of their lives. Ideally, somebody would have traveled home with Maurice to the funeral. That way he can go home and pay his respects, and you can keep an eye on him, make sure he don't get in no trouble. But that being said, I'm pretty sure the NCAA rules wouldn't permit that because they had no interest in protecting the athlete. So when I first read this, I felt that maybe Maurice was being a bit unreasonable. He was a bit spoiled and entitled at this point, and he seemed like the type to completely ignore that paperwork. But after thinking through the whole situation, I actually lean a little more to his side because the admittedly circumstantial evidence seemed to align a little more with him. Here's what I mean. Now, we know Ohio State's boosters were giving them illegal benefits, so coming up with money for a plane ticket couldn't have been that hard. In the same way the athletic director looked the other way when the boosters slid Maurice money under the table. If he really wanted to, he probably could have done the same thing when it came to travel for the funeral. Now, when it comes to Maurice, to say he didn't have the money is a weird situation because we already know boosters were giving him bread. Now, he was a young kid getting the money, so maybe he had spent it all, but let's assume that if he had it, he'd have bought his own ticket. So we assuming he didn't have the money at this point. Now, there's fault on both sides, and this is pure opinion, but I do lean toward Ohio State not wanting him to go with the championship game being so close, which would kind of qualify for putting football over his friend's life. But with all of this happening right before the game, it's really a wonder that they actually won. But while they won the battle, they lost the war, and the relationship between Maurice and Ohio State would be severely and permanently damaged. Maurice had publicly called the athletic director a liar and questioned his morality in front of the sports world. With that said, man, rules were being bent and broken and manipulated constantly to get players on the field. But I suspect that because this request might have kept a player off the field, the hands were thrown in the air a lot quicker than usual. Okay, so watch this. A teaching assistant accused Maurice of not attending a single class, but he somehow remained eligible and got all good grades. This would imply that the school had no problem forging some paperwork, but the travel paperwork was where they drew the line. I'm sure still today, but especially back then, universities would create these circumstances by essentially propping kids up as student athletes when really, dog, they was just pure athletes. Not that they didn't have the intelligence to do the schoolwork, but there were systems in place so that they did not have to. So essentially, the school would create the system, plug the athlete into the system, but then if things get found out, the athlete takes 100% of the L. And to be fair, that wasn't always the case. Sometimes a school would get scholarships taken or something like that, but the athlete always got hit the hardest. But if the athlete is just existing in the system you created, shouldn't the creators and maintainers of the system be punished 10 times harder than the kid? And why was utilizing the system perfectly fine until the dude needed to go home to the funeral? Now, with that said, Maurice played his hand like a ranked amateur. I'm talking about the type of cat you never want on your team in spades. Once he called them out publicly, he created an enemy who had major power and authority over him as a player. So when he was accused of accepting illegal benefits, it's just his word against the athletic director. Who do you think they're gonna believe? Maurice attacked an enemy that he had no hope to defeat. At one point, Maurice's dad was totally convinced that his son's suspension was only gonna be for 6 games. But the enemy Maurice made, the athletic director, wasn't quite done wielding his power. He declined to confirm the 6-game suspension theory and instead said no decision would be made for another week. And when the time came, the suspension was not for 6 games, but for the entire next season. Lesson number 5. I think this is the last one. Sometimes we get angry and we want to crash out publicly. oftentimes we be in the right. I got stories of big sports networks attacking my channel behind the scenes, but I don't have the leverage yet to win those wars, so I have to take small L's and lose a small battle so I can fight another day. So what do? You take note of it and bide your time. Once you get to the point where you either got nothing to lose or you've built your status beyond their reach, then you can begin to speak on some of those things. But if you jump out there too soon like your boy Maurice did, a powerful opponent gon' haymaker your ass. You fighting in a dungeon you got no business being in right now. You can't even see they level, it just got question marks over. Go grind, level yourself up, and come back later when you actually got a shot. A war is long, a battle can last years. Falling back and regrouping is a viable strategy. So while I don't believe we get to choose our battles, we do get to choose how and when we attack. Chapter 8, Stacking Bad Days. It turns out a booster had paid Maurice's cell phone bill since this man was a junior in high school. So they went back, and every time that was counted as an individual infraction. They also found small things like a $250 check he took for going to a birthday party. Then they hit him for like $10,000 worth of clothing, cash, and stereo equipment. He also had a confusing situation concerning those items I just named and a false police report. I don't know if that was an insurance scam he was trying to run. Maurice said at one point that he was just a fall guy for the school. According to one article, Maurice said Coach Tressel got him the loaner car and hooked him up with a landscaping job that he got paid for but didn't have to go to. He also said Coach Tressel introduced him to boosters who slipped him money in the thousands based on how well he played. He said the academic advisor enrolled him in independent study courses and also put him with hand-picked teachers who would pass him whether he attended classes or if he did. He said his advisor also introduced him to a tutor who prepared outlines and told him what to write. Now earlier I talked about it from the school's point of view, but real quick I gotta talk about this from Maurice's point of view. If they did all of that, then the first time something didn't go your way, you called them out in a press conference. There was about 1,000 better ways that you could have handled that. And with the money they was funneling you, the fake job you had, if and as if the problem with the funeral was simply paying for the travel expenses, you should have had the money to take care of that, and if you had spent it all, that's on you. After Maurice came out and said all of that stuff, the athletic director took the gloves off. He said, quote, "We went through a year-long investigation of our athletic program. Everything that Clarett has to allege. He vowed to me that he would do something to try to get us, and this may be what he's trying to do, so he's on his own. We dealt with this guy for 18 months. I just hope you've checked into the background and the history of who you're dealing with. Now that we kind of put everything on the table, I do get where the athletic director is coming from. Like I said, once Maurice decided to call them out publicly, he'd already lost because they have all the leverage. Of course you on your own. I hope you understood that before you went in that press conference and started talking. According to Maurice, after being suspended, he immediately went back into the street life. And he was so mad at Ohio State for having let him go that he let go of his better judgment. So the freshman phenom, who was already well known, decided to sell narcotics back in his hometown. But after his high profile name got him robbed a couple times, he decided to take his business to Los Angeles. For a couple of days, it was just nice to get away from people constantly asking about what happened at Ohio State. You know what I'm saying? The move allowed him to breathe freely for a moment. But he didn't go to LA just to breathe freely. Remember what he was doing before he went out there. He was back selling drugs, trying to make quick money, making every terrible decision he could possibly come up with. It wasn't long before he met some guys who were well funded and well connected out in LA. Maurice got caught up with these guys, one of whom was said to have been linked up with the mob. Now Maurice didn't speak much on this part in any of the interviews that I saw. I remembered the headline from back in the day, but I couldn't find good information to substantiate it. Don't get me wrong, there's a few articles that make a connection, but as far as real details, there wasn't much really there. Maybe that's because it was a bit overstated and was used as more of a clickbait thing. But in my personal opinion, I believe it's true. Primarily because it aligns perfectly with Maurice rushing through every single process. Why wouldn't this include the process of getting money? Ever since he was a kid, things had come easy. He'd fallen into an apartment. Someone was paying his rent. Someone was paying his phone bill. He had a cushy job in college that he didn't have to go to. People handed him money. And he seems to have tried to run an insurance scam. Weeks after getting suspended, he was back selling drugs. So that move would be consistent with the types of moves that he made. We also know that he was impressionable. The same way the older kids had him break into that house when he went out to LA and got himself around all that money, it's not a stretch to think he would have quickly gotten himself caught up into it. In certain interviews, he also talks about a friend who allowed him to drive these fancy and lavish cars, and he was so close to it that he admitted that at times he'd forget that these things were not his. Now again, this is all strictly speculation. In my opinion, I didn't find concrete evidence. But if it is true, and he had real involvement, then you'd still expect him to skim over certain details in the interview. For one, his own safety, then you got street ethics and a bunch of other reasons. Either way, he keeps this part of the story pretty light on details, which I respect because in my opinion, it's one of the smartest things he did. Chapter 9, Suing the NFL. Before he went to LA, Maurice sued the NFL to try to force them to let him enter the draft early. The NFL has a rule that a player has to be out of high school for 3 years before joining their league. Maurice's first year at Ohio State was 2002, and Ohio State had already denied his reinstatement. So Maurice decided it was time to make a push for the league. On the surface, this seems like just another case of Maurice trying to rush through the process. But in this particular case, he didn't have a lot of choices, which was mostly his fault, but the fact still remains. Back then, transferring meant you'd have to sit out a year, and that's after serving the 18-month suspension. So the timing to get to the league would still be the same, and he'd incur even more risk having to play a whole nother college season in a different offense for a different coach. Probably not worth the risk. Either way, he wouldn't be eligible for the draft until 2005, meaning he'd be out of football entirely for a full 2 years unless he could convince the courts that he should be allowed to play in the league earlier than their rules permit. Surprisingly, he actually won the case initially, but then the decision was overturned. Chapter 10, As a Man Thinketh. Part 3. This put Maurice in a dangerous mental state. Football started to feel like it was a million miles away. The further away it crept, the more Maurice embraced his core identity. Maurice the football player completely lost out to Maurice the gangster. Maurice had yet to learn how to cope with life, and there was a whole lot of stuff going wrong in his. Without football, there was just a hole there. There was something missing, and he didn't feel the same. He didn't know what he was feeling, but he didn't feel like himself. He was in a constant state of anxiety and deep sadness. So he did what most people do when they feel this way. They don't address it, they simply distract themselves from it. So he turned to some of the strongest distractions on the planet: alcohol, drugs, partying, and women. When he was in Ohio, this behavior was artificially held down. There, if you was drunk at noon, people frowned on that, and that disapproval kept Maurice at least somewhat in check, you know what I'm saying? But when he went to LA, his bad behaviors were not only accepted, they were basically encouraged. This was the norm in the areas he chose to spend his time, and he sank deeper into these habits. So for the whole 2-year break from football, this was how Maurice Clarett lived. Dude had never really gotten out of shape, so he didn't understand that you can't get yourself from completely out of shape to completely in shape in just a few weeks. But that was his plan. He thought a few weeks was all it would take. And that terrible plan led to one of the worst combines ever. Chapter 11. Slow-mo runs. Finally, in February 2005, Maurice Clarett got a tryout at the NFL Combine. But this wasn't the same Maurice from a couple years earlier. He stunk up the joint, especially his 40. My man was a running back who clocked a 4.78, which for most running backs, bro, that's a death sentence. But it only takes one coach to think they can bring that freshman year at Ohio State back. Maurice was drafted 101st overall, the last pick of the 3rd round to the Denver Broncos. Experts were shocked. They thought he'd fall to the 7th round, but here he was. He got his shot. Now, what was he gonna do with it? The Broncos offered him a contract that would have paid him $400,000 guaranteed, but Maurice turned it down in hopes for something better. He instead opted for an incentive-heavy deal that would have paid him first-round money if he rushed for 1,000 yards multiple times within the first contract. In his mind, he felt like he could still do that. And if he had switched his mindset while he still had a chance, I mean, it's possible. He had the talent to pull it off. But to rush for 1,000 yards in multiple seasons, you first have to play in a single season. Maurice would show up to practice on 0 sleep, multiple times coming straight from the club. That hard-working Maurice who loved to practice was no longer there. He was a thing of the past. His arrogance back in college manifested differently. He wanted to prove how much better he was than everybody else. But now it had transformed to a sense of entitlement. He didn't need to prove he was better. The coaches should just know. With that attitude, diminished skills, and a contract that had no guarantee, dude was ripe for the pick, and Maurice got cut before ever playing a single down in the NFL. Hard pressed for money, he kicked around ideas of signing with everybody from the indoor football league to NFL Europe. But likely due to contract negotiations, none of these plans ever came to fruition. 2 years after being drafted and completing what had been a lifelong dream, it seemed like Maurice had hit rock bottom. But to everybody's surprise, dude still had quite a ways to fall. Chapter 12, Eliminate the Witness. In January 2006, Maurice was wanted back in Ohio in connection with 2 armed robberies, both of which he admitted to performing without even wearing a mask. In one of the robberies, all he got was a cell phone, which he took after realizing they had no money. He figured if he took their phone, they couldn't call the police. This time, he clearly was not in a solid state of mind. Of course, they soon found their way to a phone, called in the robbery, and Maurice got arrested. But he got out on bond and stretched out his freedom a little bit more. But by August, Maurice got pulled over while doing an illegal U-turn, which doesn't sound crazy till you realize that the U-turn was because he missed the exit on the way to eliminate the witness in his armed robbery case. I guess he figured that if taking a phone wasn't enough to keep him quiet, he would just take their lives instead. He says that this time he was popping pills, drinking, and descending into madness, which is completely reflected in his actions at this time. The gangster mindset had landed him in a situation where many gangsters before and after him find themselves with police lights behind him, a car full of guns, and limited time left as a free man. He had a loaded AK and 2 loaded handguns in the car along with an open bottle of Grey Goose. The police tried to tase him, but the taser didn't work due to the fact that he was wearing Kevlar body armor. The fact that he's making choices to willingly go from a cell phone robbery to a whole murder shows you how truly far gone he was. Eventually, the former freshman phenom was sentenced to 7.5 years in prison. He'd always been in a hurry, rushing through life while skipping over valuable life lessons. As I said in the beginning, for him, getting locked up was always a blessing in disguise, as it slowed him down and allowed him time to think. Prison forced him to sit still for the first time as an adult, and it didn't take him long to see the benefit. He started to read and learn things that he'd never known or valued before, and it changed his life. Chapter 13, As a Man Thinketh, Part 4. The Bible, aka the greatest self-help book ever written, says this: "For as he thinketh in his heart, so is he." A small illustration of how powerful your mindset can be. Growing up, Maurice saw himself as a street dude, so his thoughts manifested that type of life, despite his talent and the opportunities he had. But the second his mindset shifted, all of a sudden his reality did as well. While he was still in prison, he started a blog called The Mind of Maurice Clarett. He didn't have internet access, but he'd send the letters to his girlfriend, who would then post the letters onto the blog. Here's an excerpt from the blog so you can see how he was thinking. "I'm never coming back here, believe that. Never. I'm cool on this. It's first class living from the day I get out. I will never settle for less ever again." That goes for communication, personal relationships, housing, education, friendships, travel arrangements, everything. I have the fire in my eye. And it's dope to see that he didn't just say this, bro. When he got out, he really changed his life. While he was in there, he read psychology books, business books, and books on communication. And when he came out, he put the knowledge he attained to work immediately and turned his whole situation around. He transformed himself into something entirely different by just changing the way that he thinks. You gotta understand how powerful that is. That's why I got 4 different chapters called As a Man Thinketh. Maurice got out of prison in only 2.5 years on good behavior, and he got right to work. Since getting out, he's become a highly sought after motivational speaker who travels around telling his story. He started an agency that provides mental health services, addiction recovery, along with other services. Dude went from a criminal robbing people at gunpoint to being appointed to the board of directors of the Youngstown Regional Chamber of Commerce, bro. He's consulted with schools like UConn and others, and been invited back to Ohio State and welcomed with open arms. Years back, nobody would have ever thought this dude would be back in the position he's in. But no matter how far you fall, a mindset shift can completely transform your reality.